Okay, so tonight's study is on Rahab as we continue our character study of individuals from the Old and New Testaments that maybe there's not a whole lot said about them, and certainly generally these are types of individuals we may not talk about a whole lot in our normal class periods and our sermons and so forth, so this is an opportunity to kind of cover some of them. Before I forget, on the table in the foyer next Wednesday night's study, which is on Caleb, is already on the table. Also, Sunday's study in Titus chapter 1 is also on the table. I will email those out tonight as well. Okay, so talking about Rahab, there's really, there's two interesting facts about Rahab, one of which I don't actually have on the notes because it's related to this first point. In Matthew chapter 1 and in verse 5, we find the genealogy of Jesus, which is obviously also the genealogy all the way back to David. But it's interesting that Rahab was the great-great-grandmother to David. But what's even more interesting about that fact, given that she's also related to Jesus? What about her background is somewhat unique? She's a non-Jew. Yeah. She was a flat-out Gentile from what city? Jericho. Yeah, Jericho. In fact, she and her house were the only ones who were spared in the destruction of Jericho. And obviously, she had a lifestyle that was sinful, but she obviously made changes. There was an understanding about faith in God, which we'll talk about in a minute, and she chose to serve Jehovah under the old law. And so she became what we would call a proselyte, but she was a non-Jew, which obviously David was not faulted for that, and at no point do we see Jesus being faulted for that either, but it's just kind of an interesting tidbit about Rahab being a part of that genealogy. So in Joshua chapter 2, we're not going to read all of this, but I do want to pick up on a couple of things, and kind of just as an aside as we go through this, both with Rahab to a certain extent, as well as when we get to Caleb. There's going to be some reading I would encourage you to do on your own in preparation for next week's study, because really we're not going to have time to go through all of the details contained in the accounts regarding Caleb. So we're really going to focus on we're kind of going to go through the list of that's on our notes, and then we'll hit the questions. But in order to answer the questions, we have to have a background in studying what the scriptures were about him. So just kind of an encouragement for that. So in Joshua chapter 2, starting in verse 1, who's leading Israel at this point? Yep. So now Joshua the son of Nun sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went out and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there. Verse 2, it was told the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country." Verse 3, so the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the country." Now, as we see in verse 4, she takes the 2 men, she hides them, and then she says, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And it happened as the gate was being shut when it was dark that the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them." Verse 6, but she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax which she had laid in order on the roof. Then the men pursued them by the road to the Jordan, to the fords, and as soon as those who pursued them had gone out, they shut the gate. Verse 8, now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. for the Lord your God. He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Therefore, I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house and give me a true token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. And as we kind of see this event transpire, obviously Rahab, and of course, jumping ahead a little bit, but in Hebrews chapter 13 or chapter 11, she's mentioned as a part of these people of faith. And of course, the Hebrew writer specifically brings out the faith she shows here in Joshua chapter 2. Her acknowledgement that the Lord, Israel's God, is God of heaven above and of earth beneath. And so certainly she did not have any faith in her gods or in the gods of Jericho to save them from Jehovah. Going to Joshua chapter 6, and in verse 17, we find how that Joshua gives special importance to making sure Rahab and her family are spared as promised. Verse 17, now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. So obviously, and as he goes on, he describes the things that are to be given to God. Of course, what individual ends up stealing from the Lord of the things of Jericho, and thus Israel is defeated by the city of Ai. What was his name? The guy who stole? Huh? Sorry? What? I'm sorry, what's the name? Oh, Achan, yeah. I was hearing Hathan. I'm like, Hathan? I don't know Hathan. Achan who stole the I'll remember that. Yes, Achan was the one who stole from God the things that were supposed to be given to God. And so, all right. So that's what happens in Joshua chapter 6. So going to Hebrews chapter 11. I don't know why I was hearing Hathan. Sorry about that. Verse 31, Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 30. Verse 30 focuses on the faith of Israel, obviously, of Israel following the commands of God, doing what they told him to do, marching around the city for 6 days once, and then on the seventh day, 7 times, and then the trumpets blowing and all the people shouting and so forth. Verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. Verse 31, by faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And obviously, and of course, this is kind of at the end of the Hebrew writer's recounting of all of these individuals who by faith did great things and showed great courage. And of course, here in verse 32, after this event with Rahab that he mentions, he says, time would fail me to talk about all of the people of faith and all the events where faith was shown in the Old Testament. He talks about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and so forth. So, in James chapter 2, and in verse 25, we have a situation where after James talks about Abraham in verse 21 being justified by works, we find in verse 25, likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. Now, there are a couple other times where Rahab's name is mentioned, but it's generally mentioned in a kind of a symbolic sense. Usually it's kind of in passing, like in Psalms, and there's a couple of times in Isaiah her name is mentioned as well. But in terms of actual information about Rahab, this is pretty much it. In terms of actual background of her character and so forth, about the events regarding Rahab. I think there was 8 total times that her name comes up in the Bible. And these are kind of the few where information is given. So, talking a little bit about Rahab, we need to address a couple of things. First of all, was Rahab's lie, which was an effort to deceive the king of Jericho, was her lie excused by God in the sense that he didn't count it as wrong? That's what I mean by excuse. Did he excuse her lie because it was for a godly purpose of sparing these messengers from Israel? She lied, and she did lie, didn't she? Did she tell the truth to the king? No, she didn't. She said, yes, they did come, but then they left, and I had no idea who they were, and they took off down the street. So she led and out of the city. So she kind of led the individuals who were chasing them on a wild goose chase, while she knew full well they were on the roof, and she knew full well that it would register as doom for Jericho. Okay, that's what this represented. So was this lie not really a lie? I mean, it was for something godly, or for in the end to fulfill God's plan. And if God did excuse this, does it mean that we can lie or deceive if our end goal is something that is of the purpose of God, or from God for some godly purpose? No. All right, Nolan?
You'd have to read into it to say that God excused it, because that is not addressed positively or negatively.
Okay.
Secondly, it's not the only case in the Bible where a person who's called a faithful or a godly person lied or committed some other sin that is part of the narration or the account or a story. But that's not the point of that story, and so it's not focused on.
Okay.
As here, you think of Abraham lying on multiple occasions about Sarah. That could have brought an end to, him not being the father of many nations, and et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
Example after that.
And isn't it interesting that what the Hebrew writer does the Hebrew writer address the lie? What does he say? By faith, Rahab did what? She received the spies. He doesn't, and of course, what is the faith specifically that he is acknowledging that was in Rahab? Was it her understanding of right and wrong, or at least her understanding of how she was supposed to serve Jehovah according to the old law? I mean, did she even know the old law at that point, presumably? What did she know? She knew Israel's history, at least history that had come to them across the Jordan, and about how their God, the God of Israel, Jehovah, was the God of heaven and earth. And she knew Jericho would fall. Not because of Israel's military might, not because of some great military mind in Joshua, but because of God. That's where she laid the praise and the glory and the acknowledgement of power, was in Jehovah. And I believe in Hebrews chapter 11, that's exactly what the Hebrew writer is addressing regarding her faith. Okay, by faith she received the spies. Not by faith she lied and did something wrong. Her faith that he's addressing is the fact that she firmly believed Jehovah was going to bring down Jericho, and she wanted to save her family. Now here in James chapter 2, likewise was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works? In what sense was she justified by works? When she received the messengers and sent them out another way. Again, James doesn't address the lie either. But what does he say? He says she was justified by works. In what way? Because he talks about Abraham earlier in verse 21. Now, quite frankly, Abraham and Rahab, these are two very different individuals. I mean, Abraham was a friend of God. He was someone who served God and obeyed the law, the patriarchal law that he had. Rahab is a Gentile. She's a harlot. And as of until she must have been taught the old law, because later we see how she did join the children of Israel, it wasn't until then that she could have even been considered a servant of God. So in what way does James, when he says that she was justified by works, In what way does he mean that? Is he saying, as some, huh?
She had to put the ribbon in the window, or, I mean, she had to do that.
Okay.
That was work. That was something she had to do.
And would you say that because of her conviction that Jehovah was the mighty God in heaven and on earth, she therefore conducted or acted according to that conviction by receiving those messengers and sending them out another way? Was she convicted to do that because of her faith? Again, faith in what she knew about Jehovah. Okay? Now again, James does not address the lie. Okay, the means by which she went about it is not what's being acknowledged as being justified. It was the fact that she was convicted and did something about it. Now, the means by which she went about it included lying. Were there other opportunities for her to make this work? I don't know, maybe. But regardless, she was still in a situation where she was a sinner. She was a harlot. Okay, so the sin of lying doesn't have to be specifically addressed by any of the older New Testament writers to understand it was wrong. Just like, Sarah trying to help fulfill the promise of God to Abraham to bear a son, and so she gave Abraham her handmaiden. Okay, that wasn't Sarah's responsibility to do that. Or, for instance, tricking Isaac? Jacob tricked Isaac, that he was, it was Isaac and Jacob, right? Jacob tricked him by dressing up like Esau, right? Jacob and Esau, yeah. And was that okay? So that he would receive the firstborn blessing? To pretend he was someone else? See, there was this effort to try to help God. That was wrong. Okay, but God still would have brought about his purpose regardless. Now, I saw a hand somewhere. Yes, sir.
Part of her faith is taking a risk.
Yes.
Being a traitor to her people there.
That's true.
But knowing what you've already said about what God has done since they left Egypt, convinced her that was the side she needed to be on. That was the faith that was built in her, and it was worth the risk.
Right. Right. Nolan?
There's a growth process, for lack of a better term, in faith. I find it interesting, before you get to the point of Joshua 3 or 6, the Israelites have been told by God, I'm going to give you this land, not because you're so righteous and perfect, because of their wickedness. And yet, as the Hebrew writer says, she does not perish along with those disobedient or those that didn't believe. She's living in a wicked, she's part of a wicked society to be destroyed. But she has this beginning or seed of faith, some amount of faith.
Right.
That hopefully it's going to grow
And did, obviously.
did
Yeah.
better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it just goes to show that when we commit ourselves to serve God, is there any excuse for sin? Whether it's lying or deceiving or trying to trick our Father into giving us a firstborn blessing? If we're seeking to serve God and to be holy and righteous in His sight, is there any reason for us to ever sin in that effort to be holy or righteous? Does that even make sense? No. Okay, it's the seedlings of faith, as Nolan mentioned. It's that conviction about Jehovah that is being addressed as faith in Rahab, and certainly the risk that she took and the things that she did to protect those messengers. This is not some kind of justification of deceit or sin. All right, very quickly, how can Rahab be, yes sir?
I think also we get in the habit, like you've always said, about the consequences of sin and whatnot, where they're the same in God's eyes, but in our eyes we kind of halfway rank them.
Yeah, where lying would be less bad.
That's not as bad as
Yeah.
being a harlot
Right.
or a murderer or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. A lot of times the consequences of sin adds some element of, we feel like there's some kind of degrees of sin then. And that's not the case. Obviously, being a harlot was just as bad as lying. And that's a condemnation of lying as well. It's not minimizing being a harlot. Second question, how can Rahab be justified by faith by the Hebrew writer And then justified by works in James. And what other example in the New Testament has that exact same dynamic?
Same chapter, faith without works is dead, they go hand in hand, and Abraham, within that chapter is another example. Romans 4, he's justified by faith, but over here in James, he's saved by his works.
All right, yeah. So obviously notice how works go hand in hand with faith. Works serve how our conviction of action serves to show our conviction of mind and heart, of soul. We have to show our faith by our works, as James brings up. So these are not contradictions between Romans 4 and James 2, or Hebrews 11 and James 2. These go hand in hand, and it goes to show you can't just say, I have faith, I have faith, I have faith, and then do nothing that shows your belief in God and your conviction that He is Jehovah and that He's Almighty. You must actually obey, and that's part of that as well. Finally, what qualities and characteristics should we seek to emulate from Rahab? I can think of two main ones. The example before Jericho's destroyed, what main example do we see from her?
She saw God. She knew what she was, and she saw what God was, and she wanted to be that.
She saw the evidence that was provided, and she was convicted by that. Okay, and certainly, do we have evidence today in God's Word, eyewitness testimony? Okay, absolutely we do. Yeah, she was convicted by faith that this God is the God of all. And then after Jericho is destroyed, what then do we see? Yeah, so after Jericho's destroyed, I mean, she and her family could have gone their way. They could have gone found a new city to dwell in, but what did they do? They become a part of the people of God. That conviction, or at least on Rahab's end, as far as it's implied that her family did as well, her conviction led to her actually committing herself to serving God, which then led to the birth of David, then led to the birth of Jesus, which is kind of the great overarching story here, that it's amazing when people submit themselves to God, how God will use the people of faith, and I mean, and everyone, He'll bring about His will regardless. But people of faith, like some harlot Gentile, can become a key component in the bringing about of David and ultimately Jesus. All right, any thoughts or comments through Rahab? All right, so keep in mind, yes sir. Okay, keep in mind next week we will have the discussion on Caleb. Those notes are on the back table. Also on Sunday we'll talk about Titus chapter 1. And I will email out those notes tonight. Thanks, everybody.